while I was at a meeting. My boss moved my team's desks to the basement, claiming, "Our new star employee deserves the best offices." When I got back and saw my team upset, I just smiled and said, "Pack your bags." My boss had no idea what was coming. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The elevator ride down felt like descending into a grave. With each floor, the numbers ticked past, the air grew staler, heavier. When the doors finally opened, they didn't reveal a polished lobby or a collaborative workspace. They opened onto a concrete corridor that smelled of old paper and neglect. I had to step over a coiled extension cord just to get to the heavy steel door marked Archives. I pushed it open, the hinges screaming in protest. Inside, the only light came from flickering fluorescent tubes that buzzed like trapped insects. Dust motes danced in the stale air, settling on rows of metal shelving units packed with rolled-up blueprints dating back to the 1980s. And there, in the center of this tomb, was my team. 7 of the most brilliant structural engineers in Chicago were huddled around folding tables that looked like they'd been salvaged from a church basement sale. Their high-end monitors were balanced precariously on stacks of old project files. Maya, my lead engineer, who could calculate wind loads in her head faster than most people could type them into a computer, was trying to wipe a layer of grime off her keyboard with a tissue. She looked up as I entered, and the expression on her face broke my heart. It wasn't anger. It was humiliation. "Sierra," she said quietly. "Richard came down an hour ago. He said we were making too much noise upstairs. He said the clacking of our keyboards was distracting Tyler's creative flow." I looked around the room. There were no windows, no ventilation, just the oppressive weight of the building pressing down on us from above. This was the vault. It was where the firm sent things it wanted to forget. Old contracts, retired licenses, and now, us. Upstairs, in the glass-walled studio we had occupied just yesterday, sunlight would be streaming in off Lake Michigan. We had earned that space. We had billed $20 million last year alone. We were the ones who made sure the firm's avant-garde designs didn't collapse under their own weight. We were the physics behind the fantasy. But to Richard, we were just the help, the invisible mechanics who tightened the bolts while the artists took the bows. I walked over to where David, my junior engineer, was staring blankly at a blank wall. He was 24, fresh out of MIT, full of fire and ambition. Now he looked like a prisoner of war. "He took my chair," David whispered. "Tyler took my ergonomic chair. He said his back needed support for the heavy lifting of ideation. He gave me this." He gestured to a metal folding chair. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. This wasn't just a relocation. This was an eviction. It was a statement. It was Richard telling us exactly where we stood in the hierarchy of his empire. We were the foundation, yes. But foundations are meant to be buried. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't storm back upstairs to make a scene. Emotion is wasted energy in a structural failure. You don't scream at a cracking beam. You reinforce it or you remove the load. I looked at my team. "Listen to me," I said, my voice steady in the dim light. "Pack your personal items. But don't go home yet. We have work to do." I wasn't just angry. I was calculating. Richard thought he had put us in the basement to get us out of the way. He didn't realize he had just put the people who knew where all the bodies were buried right next to the files that proved it. I took the stairs back up to the 42nd floor. I needed the physical exertion to burn off the adrenaline spiking in my blood. When I pushed open the glass doors to Studio A, the contrast was physical. The air here was cool, filtered, and smelled of expensive espresso. The light bouncing off the floor-to-ceiling windows was blinding. This was the space my team had secured. We had pulled all-nighters here, drinking stale coffee and running simulations until our eyes burned, just to land the City Museum contract. Now, a stranger was sitting in my ergonomic chair. Tyler looked exactly as his resume suggested. 29, dressed in a suit that cost more than my first car, with the kind of perfectly messy hair that takes an hour to style. He wasn't looking at blueprints. He was looking at a tablet, swiping through AI-generated images of buildings that defied gravity and logic. He looked up as I approached. He didn't stand. He didn't offer a hand. He just smiled, a wide, vacuous expression of someone who has never been told no. "You must be Sierra," he said. "Richard told me you were managing the back-end stuff." "The math. The structural engineering," I corrected, my voice flat. "The physics that keeps the building from killing people." Tyler waved a hand dismissively. "Right, the constraints. I'm here to remove constraints. I'm here to disrupt the skyline." He turned back to the desk. My desk. He had swept my Pritzker team recognition plaque into a waste bin. In its place, he was arranging a series of framed concept art pieces, swirling, organic shapes that looked like melting candle wax. "Richard loves the energy," Tyler said, gesturing to a screen. "Look at this. No right angles, no support columns, just pure flow." I looked at the screen. "That's a cantilever, extending 40 feet without a truss," I said. "It will snap under its own weight before the glass is even installed." "That's negative thinking," a voice boomed from the doorway. Richard walked in, beaming. He clapped a hand on Tyler's shoulder, looking at the young man with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious figures. "Sierra," Richard said, his tone cooling as he turned to me. "I see you've met our new visionary design consultant. Tyler is bringing a fresh perspective." We were getting too, rigid. "Rigid is what keeps skyscrapers standing, Richard," I said. "See?" Richard sighed, looking at Tyler. "This is what I was talking about. No imagination, just rules." I stood there, watching them, and suddenly, the anger evaporated. It was replaced by a clinical, cold realization. I knew exactly what was happening here. In psychology, it is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It is a cognitive bias where people with low ability at a task overestimate their ability. It comes down to a simple, terrifying truth. Incompetent people do not possess the skills necessary to recognize their own incompetence. Tyler wasn't lying. He wasn't trying to sabotage us. He genuinely believed he was a genius. He spoke with the absolute, unshakable confidence of a man who has never had to calculate a wind load or factor in thermal expansion. He didn't know enough about engineering to be afraid of gravity. True experts are cautious. We speak in probabilities and safety factors because we know the 1,000 different ways a structure can fail. We are haunted by the physics. But to a man like Richard, a man who cares about magazine covers and gala openings, my caution looked like fear. And Tyler's ignorance? It looked like vision. Richard mistook confidence for competence. And that mistake was going to cost him everything. "We don't need calculators leading the charge anymore," Richard said, checking his watch. "We have software for the math. We need dreams. Tyler is the future, Sierra. You can either get on board and support his vision from downstairs, or you can get out of the way." I looked at Tyler's screen again. The melting wax building. It was beautiful. It was seductive. And it was a death trap. I realized then that arguing was pointless. You cannot use logic to defeat a delusion. If Richard wanted a dream, I would let him have it. I would let him build his castle in the clouds. I just wouldn't be inside when it hit the ground. "I understand," I said. "I'll go back downstairs and organize the transition." Richard nodded, already turning back to Tyler's glowing screen. "Good. Make sure the files are accessible. Tyler needs a clean slate." "Oh, he'll get everything he needs," I said. I turned and walked out of the light, heading back to the darkness where the real work and the real weapon was waiting. When I stepped back into the vault, the silence was heavy enough to crush a lung. David had already packed a cardboard box. He was unplugging his mouse, his movements jerky and angry. Maya was staring at her screen, her finger hovering over the send button on what I knew was a resignation email. The air tasted of defeat. They weren't just leaving, they were retreating. They felt small. They felt like the help that had been dismissed because the master of the house got tired of looking at them. "Don't hit send," I said. My voice cut through the hum of the ventilation fans. Maya looked up, her eyes red. "Sierra, I can't do it," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't sit down here and do the math for a guy who thinks gravity is a suggestion." "I have dignity." "I know you do," I said, walking to the center of the room. "That's why we aren't resigning, not yet." "What are we waiting for?" David snapped, shoving a framed photo into his box. An apology? It's not coming. No, I said. We are waiting for the transfer. I looked at them. 7 people who could calculate the stress point of a suspension bridge in their sleep. They were brilliant. And Richard had convinced them they were worthless because they weren't shiny. I needed them to see what I saw. Look up, I said, pointing to the ceiling. They looked. Above us, running along the concrete slab, was a massive, rusted steel I-beam. It was ugly. It was covered in dust and fireproofing spray. It looked nothing like the polished chrome and glass of the lobby upstairs. That beam, I said, my voice low and steady. Nobody takes photos of it. Nobody gives it an award. When people walk into this building, they talk about the atrium. They talk about the light. They talk about the facade. I walked over and placed my hand on the cold, rough metal of a support column. But this beam is holding up 40 floors of ego. It is holding up the glass penthouse. It is holding up Richard's office. It is invisible, unpraised, and silent. But if you remove it, the whole thing comes down. I turned to face them. We are the steel beams. Richard thinks he can swap us out for drywall because drywall is prettier. He thinks he can paint over the physics, but he forgets what happens when you remove the load-bearing wall. I saw a shift in Maya's eyes. The shame was evaporating, replaced by a spark of recognition. We aren't going to quit like victims, I said. We are going to leave like a structural failure, sudden, catastrophic, and entirely according to code. I pulled a folder from my bag and dropped it on the folding table. It landed with a heavy thud. I just got off the phone with Patricia, I said. The room went still. Patricia ran the rival firm across town. She was Richard's fiercest competitor, mostly because she actually understood engineering. She knows about the city museum contract, I continued. She knows Richard is pivoting to aesthetics first, and she knows that means the real talent is currently sitting in a basement looking for an exit. I opened the folder. She is offering base salaries of $185,000, $50,000 signing bonuses, full creative control over the structural division, and a corner office with windows that actually open. David dropped his box. Maya stood up. For who? David asked. You? For all of us, I said. It's a package deal. The invisible architecture division. But we have to move fast. And we have to move smart. I leaned in, lowering my voice. We aren't just walking out. We are going to initiate the transition plan. Richard wants a clean slate for Tyler. We are going to give him exactly that. We are going to organize every single file, every calculation, every simulation. We are going to pack up our intellectual property so neatly that he won't even realize what he's losing until he tries to open a file and realizes he doesn't know how to read the language. We are going to let Tyler design his dream building, I said, a cold smile touching my lips. And we are going to make sure that when we walk out that door, we take the physics with us. Vega, my senior hardware specialist, who had been silent in the corner, finally spoke up. He cracked his knuckles. I'll start pulling the server logs, he said. If we're leaving, I'm making sure we don't leave a single byte of our proprietary algorithms behind. Do it, I said. The energy in the room shifted instantly. They weren't a defeated team in a basement anymore. They were a demolition crew. And they had just been given the detonator. 3 days later, the summons came. We were called back upstairs to the main conference room not to participate, but to witness the future. The room was packed. Junior designers, interns, and stakeholders were all crowded around the main display wall. Richard stood at the front, looking like a ringmaster about to unveil a tiger. Tyler stood next to him, wearing a suit that was too tight and a smile that was too wide. I stood in the back with Maya and David. We were the ghosts at the banquet. Silent. Watchful. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard announced, his voice booming. For the City Museum project, we promised something iconic. We promised to redefine the Chicago skyline. And Tyler has delivered. He pulled the velvet sheet off the presentation board. A collective gasp went through the room. I didn't gasp. I squinted. The rendering showed a massive, glittering structure jutting out from the main museum body over Lakeshore Drive. It was a cantilevered wing made entirely of glass and steel, curving upward like a wave about to break. It had no visible supports, no trusses, just a sleek, seamless arc extending 80 feet into the air. "We call it the infinity curve," Tyler said, beaming. "It represents the limitless potential of the human spirit." I walked forward. The crowd parted for me, mostly because I was the only person in the room not smiling. I walked right up to the board. I looked at the connection point where the steel met the existing concrete structure. I looked at the curvature. I looked at the materials list. "It's beautiful," I said. Tyler preened. "Thank you. I wanted to capture the essence of flight." "It's also physically impossible," I added. The room went dead silent. Tyler's smile twitched. "Excuse me?" "Chicago wind loads," I said, pointing to the tip of the curve. At this extension, with no external bracing, a 60-mile-per-hour gust off the lake will create a torsional force of roughly 400,000 pounds. The steel will twist, the glass will shatter, and the entire structure will shear off the main building and crush rush-hour traffic on Lakeshore Drive. I turned to Richard. "It's a death trap, Richard. It creates a wind tunnel effect that will amplify the vibrations. It's the Tacoma Narrows Bridge waiting to happen, but with glass shrapnel." Richard's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He stepped between me and the board, shielding the art from my logic. "This is exactly why you're in the basement, Sierra." He spat. "You look for problems. Tyler looks for solutions." "Gravity isn't a problem you solve with optimism," I countered, my voice rising just enough to carry to the back of the room. "It's a law. You cannot build this. The thermal expansion alone on that much curved glass will pop the panels out of the frame the first time the temperature drops below zero." "Enough!" Richard slammed his hand on the table. He looked around the room, seeing the nervous glances of the junior staff. He needed to reassert control. He needed to humiliate me. "You know what this is?" Richard said, a sneer curling his lip. "This isn't physics. This is jealousy." He laughed. A harsh, barking sound. "You're bitter, Sierra. You're bitter because Tyler is young, he's fresh, and he has ideas that don't involve spreadsheets. You're aging out of relevance, and you can't stand it. You're trying to sabotage his moment because you know you could never dream this big." He turned to the room. "She's an anchor," he declared. "She wants to drag us all down to the bottom because she's afraid to fly. Well, I'm done listening to anchors." He picked up a gold fountain pen. He pulled the construction approval documents toward him, the legal forms that authorized the design for immediate contracting. "Richard, don't," I said. "It was my last professional courtesy. If you sign that, you are authorizing a structural failure. You are accepting liability for a design that cannot stand." "Watch me," he said. He looked me dead in the eye and signed his name with a flourish. The scratch of the pen on paper sounded like a bone snapping. "Construction starts in 2 weeks, Richard announced, tossing the pen onto the table. "With or without you." I looked at the signature. It was done. He had officially, legally approved a building that violated the laws of physics. He had bypassed the safety review. He had ignored the warning. I felt a strange calm settle over me. The anger was gone. In its place was the cold, hard certainty of equation balancing out. "Understood," I said. I turned to my team. Maya looked terrified. David looked sick. I gave them a barely perceptible nod. "The trap is set. Enjoy your moment, Tyler," I said softly as I walked past him. "You really have defied gravity." I walked out of the conference room, leaving them to their applause. They thought they were celebrating a masterpiece. They didn't realize they were clapping for their own funeral. Friday morning arrived with the precision of a Swiss watch. I didn't bring a cardboard box to the office. I didn't bring a plant. I brought a single, encrypted flash drive. Down in the lobby, Patricia was waiting. She wasn't hiding in a car or lurking in a coffee shop. She was sitting on one of the velvet sofas, reviewing a stack of contracts on her tablet. She looked up as I walked in with my team behind me. 7 people, dressed not in the dusty jeans of the basement, but in the sharp, tailored suits of executives. Patricia stood up. She didn't hug us. She shook my hand. "The contracts are executed," she said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who knows they just won the lottery. Base salaries of $185,000. $50,000 signing bonuses for each member wire transferred this morning. Benefits start immediately. Thank you, Patricia, I said. We'll be down in 20 minutes. Take your time, she smiled. I enjoy watching a demolition. We took the elevator up to the penthouse for the last time. We didn't knock. We walked into the main conference room where Richard and Tyler were sipping lattes, looking at fabric swatches for the museum's interior. Richard looked up, annoyed. Sierra? I thought I told you to stay downstairs until the transition files were ready. They're ready, I said. I placed the flash drive on the center of the mahogany table. It made a sharp click against the wood. This drive contains everything, I said. Every CAD file, every load calculation, every vendor contact, and every server log from the structural division. It is the entire intellectual property of the team you exiled. Richard smirked. He picked up the drive, tossing it in his hand like a toy. Finally, he said, now Tyler can really get to work without you dragging your feet. I accept your resignations, by the way. I assume that's what this is? A dramatic exit? Tyler didn't even look up from his swatches. Bye, Sierra. Good luck with the math. There is one more file on that drive, I said. Folder 001. It's titled Structural Liability Assessment, the Infinity Curve. Richard paused. What is that? It is a certified engineering report, I said, my voice dropping to a register that was purely transactional. It details the thermal expansion coefficients of the curved glass panels Tyler specified. It proves, with mathematical certainty, that when the temperature in Chicago drops below zero, which it does roughly 40 days a year, the steel frame will contract 3 millimeters more than the glass. I took a step closer. The panels won't just crack, Richard. They will explode. The entire facade will rain glass onto the street below. It is a 100% probability of catastrophic failure within 6 months of completion. Richard laughed, but it sounded hollow. You're bluffing. You're just trying to scare me because you're jealous. I don't bluff, I said. I calculate. And here is the interesting part, I continued. Yesterday, you signed the construction authorization. You legally approved the design. At that moment, you were just incompetent. You could claim ignorance. You could say you trusted your visionary consultant. But now? Now you are in possession of a certified report, time-stamped and logged, that informs you the building is lethal. If you proceed with construction now, it is no longer an accident. It is criminal negligence. The color drained from Richard's face so fast it looked like a special effect. If you build it, I said, you go to prison. If you don't build it, you have to explain to the city council and the donors why the visionary design you just sold them is a physical impossibility. You will have to admit that you fired the only team capable of fixing it, and that you wasted millions on a drawing that can't exist in the real world. Tyler looked up, his confusion finally breaking through his arrogance. What is she talking about, Richard? Thermal what? Shut up, Tyler, Richard whispered. He stared at the drive in his hand as if it were a live grenade. You trapped me, he said, his voice trembling with rage. You waited until I signed the papers. I waited until you made your choice, I corrected. You chose aesthetics over physics. You chose a fraud over your foundation. I just made sure the paperwork reflected that choice. I looked at my team. They were standing tall, their shoulders back. They weren't the help anymore. They were the architects of this moment. We're leaving now, I said. Patricia is waiting downstairs. Oh, and Richard? He looked up, sweat beading on his forehead. Don't try to delete the file. I sent a copy to the firm's liability insurance provider this morning. They have a right to know what they're covering. I turned my back on him. I didn't look at the view. I didn't look at the expensive furniture. Behind us, I heard the sound of Tyler asking, but we can still use the glass, right? And the sound of Richard screaming. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It sounded like gravity finally taking over. 6 months is a long time in the world of construction. It is enough time to pour a foundation, erect a steel skeleton, and watch a skyline change. But it is also enough time for a reputation to collapse completely. I walked into my office at Patricia's firm. It wasn't a glass penthouse designed to intimidate clients, and it wasn't a dusty vault designed to hide secrets. It was a workspace. It was filled with natural light, wide tables covered in schematics, and the hum of respectful collaboration. Maya was in the conference room next door, leading the structural review for a new municipal library. She wasn't shrinking into her chair, or apologizing for doing the math. She was commanding the room. David was working on a wind simulation for a high-rise, sitting in a chair that actually supported his spine. We weren't the back end anymore. We weren't the help. We were the partners. The transition hadn't been seamless, leaving a toxic environment never is. There were legal threats from Richard, blustering emails, and attempts to withhold our final commissions. But Patricia's legal team handled them with the same ruthless efficiency my team applied to load calculations. And as for Richard, the City Museum project never broke ground. It turned out that when you hand a certified report proving criminal negligence to an insurance underwriter, they tend to pull coverage very quickly. Without insurance, the city pulled the permits. Without permits, the donors pulled the funding. Richard tried to spin it. He tried to claim he was reimagining the vision. But the damage was done. He had to stand in front of the city council and explain why he had approved a design that was mathematically guaranteed to explode. He had to admit that he had fired the only people who knew how to keep the building standing. The infinity curve became a joke in the industry, a symbol of hubris over physics. Richard's firm lost the $25 million retainer, and the breach of contract lawsuits are still winding their way through the courts. He is currently selling off his assets to cover the legal fees. And Tyler? The visionary? It wasn't the physics that finally took him down. It was the plagiarism. When the scrutiny on the project intensified, someone realized that the revolutionary design of the curve looked suspiciously like a concept art piece from a student portfolio in Berlin. Tyler hadn't just ignored the laws of physics, he had stolen the idea that violated them. He was fired for cause. Last I heard, he was designing virtual real estate for the metaverse, where gravity is optional and thermal expansion doesn't exist. I left the office early that afternoon. I drove out to the site of our new project, a hospital wing on the west side. It wasn't glamorous. It wouldn't be on the cover of an art magazine, but it was important. I put on my hard hat and walked through the mud to the framing. The skeleton of the building was going up. I walked over to a massive steel column, rising 40 feet out of the concrete footing. I took off my glove and placed my hand against the cold, rough metal. It was raw. It was ugly to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. It was covered in mill scale and shot markings. Soon, it would be covered in fireproofing, then drywall, then paint. The doctors and nurses and patients who walked these halls would never see it. They would never know it was there. But I knew. I felt the vibration of the city humming through the steel. This beam was doing the heavy lifting. It didn't need applause. It didn't need a plaque. It just needed to be strong. Richard had called us anchors. He meant it as an insult. He thought anchors dragged you down. He forgot that without an anchor, the ship drifts. Without an anchor, you are at the mercy of the wind. We were the anchors. We were the foundation. And while his castle in the clouds had dissipated like vapor, our work was still here, solid, real, built to last. I looked up at the sky, framed by the steel grid we had designed. I took a deep breath of the cold Chicago air. It tasted like concrete and dust and absolute freedom. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to shout or to fight. It is simply to stand your ground, do the math, and let gravity do the rest. If you know a Sierra in your workplace, someone who quietly keeps the whole operation from falling apart, while others take the credit, tag them in the comments below. They deserve to be seen. And if you are that person, remember, the building is nothing without the beam.